Kneel, Seraphine. Kneel and place the crown upon her head yourself." The words landed in the great hall like stones dropped into still water, and for a moment the whole world narrowed to the cold marble beneath her feet and the sound of her own heartbeat stuttering to a halt. Seraphine felt the mate bond snap, not metaphorically, not gently, but a physical rupture that tore through her chest like a hook ripping free of flesh. Her knees buckled. Her breath came thin. Somewhere behind her ribs, where for 7 years she had carried the warm, humming thread that tied her soul to Calen Thornwood, Alpha King of the Ironcrest Pack, there was now only a raw and bleeding absence, a phantom wound that pulsed with every beat of a heart that no longer had a reason to beat. She did not scream. That was the first decision she made in the ruins of her old life, and she made it in the space of a single indrawn breath. She would not give them the satisfaction of her screaming. She lifted her chin and let the pain pool silently in her eyes, and she thought, with a clarity so cold it frightened her, "You will regret this hall. You will regret every stone of it." The court had gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling of blackened oak and hanging iron, 300 wolves in their finest, come to witness what they had been told was a coronation. Seraphine had believed, until an hour ago, that the crown of Ironcrest's queen would settle upon her own brow tonight. She had earned it. She had spent 7 years earning it, brick by brick, treaty by treaty, harvest by harvest. But Calen stood upon the dais in his ceremonial furs, tall and golden and terrible, and beside him stood Ivona, Seraphine's dearest friend, the woman who had wept on her shoulder through 3 winters of grief, the woman she had pulled from a snowbank half dead and nursed back to strength with her own hands. Ivona wore white. Ivona wore triumph, and in Calen's grip glittered the queen's crown, a circlet of silver moonstone that Seraphine had polished 100 times in daydreams she would now have to strangle. "You mistake me," Seraphine said, and her voice did not shake, and that in itself was a small victory she hoarded like a coin. "I do not kneel to crown a thief." A ripple moved through the assembled wolves. Calen's jaw tightened. He had expected obedience, because obedience was all she had ever shown him, the loyal Luna-in-waiting, the tireless steward of his lands, the woman who managed his ledgers and his grain stores and his fractious border lords while he hunted glory in the Western wars. He had mistaken her patience for submission. He had mistaken her competence for something owed to him, a natural resource to be drawn upon and never replenished. "You will do this," he said, low, "or you will be cast out with nothing. The choice is yours, Seraphine. But the pack has spoken. Ivona will be my queen. She carries the blood of the Silver Moon line, and an alliance with the Silver Moon packs is worth more to Ironcrest than—" He paused, and she watched him choose the cruelest available word, "than sentiment." Sentiment. 7 years reduced to sentiment. She almost laughed, and the almost laugh was bitter and humorless, and it burned her throat on the way up. She looked at Ivona then, really looked at her, and saw beneath the veil of triumph a flicker of something that was not shame, but was pretending, badly, to be shame. "You told me you loved him like a brother," Seraphine said softly. "You wept in my kitchen. You wore my mother's shawl." "I still have it," Ivona said, and smiled. "It suits me." That smile was the second rupture, worse in some ways than the first, because the mate bond had at least been Calen's to break. But this friendship, had been Seraphine's own, freely given, and its betrayal was a wound she had helped inflict by loving too openly. She felt something inside her go very still and very quiet, the way a forest goes still before a storm. When she spoke again, she spoke not to Evona, but to the whole hall, and her voice carried the way it always had when she read the harvest counts, or settled disputes between grazing lords, clear and steady and impossible to ignore. "I have served this pack for 7 years," she said. "I have balanced its accounts and fed its poor and brokered peace with the river clans when your armies could not. I know where every coin is buried and every debt is owed. I know the true state of Ironcrest's coffers, Cailan, and I know what you do not, that this crown you are so eager to give away sits upon a kingdom far poorer than you believe." She saw his eyes flicker, just for an instant, just enough. "But you have made your choice. So I will make mine. I will not kneel. I will not crown her. I will walk out of this hall, and I will take nothing that you gave me, because you gave me nothing that was not first a burden. And one day, not soon, but one day, you will stand where I am standing now, and you will understand exactly what you threw into the snow." She turned. Behind her she heard Cailan's voice rise, sharp with the fury of a man unused to being denied. But the words did not reach her. The bond was severed. His commands no longer touched her. She walked the length of the great hall alone, past 300 silent faces, and not one of them stopped her. And the great doors opened onto a night as cold and clean as a blade, and she stepped through it, and she did not look back. The cold outside the hall was the first honest thing Seraphine had felt in hours, and she breathed it in like a woman surfacing from deep water. Her chambers were on the eastern side of the fortress, up a winding stair that smelled of tallow and old stone, and she climbed it now with a steadiness that surprised even her, because her body knew what her heart had not yet accepted, that this was not despair. This was departure, and departure, unlike despair, could be planned. She had, in fact, been planning it for longer than she cared to admit, not because she had foreseen this exact humiliation, but because a woman who manages a kingdom's ledgers learns to read the difference between a man who values her and a man who merely uses her. And Seraphine had read that difference in Cailan's eyes months ago, in the way he had begun to speak of Evona's bloodline, in the way he no longer asked her opinion on matters he once would not decide without her. She had told herself she was imagining it, but some deeper, colder part of her had not believed the reassurance, and that part had been quietly, methodically preparing. In her chambers she did not weep. She lit a single candle and she knelt, the only kneeling she would do that night, before the hearth, and she pried loose the third stone from the left of the fireplace, the loose one she had loosened herself over the course of a year of patient work, and she drew out a leather satchel heavy with the things she would need. Coin, first. Not the allowance Cailan had granted her, which she left untouched in its lacquered box upon the dresser, but coin she had earned herself, skimmed legitimately from the merchant's fees she had negotiated on the pack's behalf, a percentage that was hers by the old contracts and that no one had ever thought to question, because no one else had ever bothered to read the old contracts. There was gold there, and silver, and 3 letters of credit drawn upon the great trading house of Valemont in the southern free city of Halvery, made out in a name that was not Seraphine Thornwood, and had never been Seraphine Thornwood. There was a deed, too, to a modest counting house in Halvery that she had purchased 18 months ago through an intermediary, a purchase she had made on the night Cailan first spoke Ivona's name with warmth in his voice. She had told herself that night that she was being foolish. She had made the purchase anyway. She changed out of the ceremonial gown, folding it with care and laying it across the bed, because it was pack property, and she would leave it as she would leave everything else. She dressed instead in travel clothes, wool and leather, nothing that marked her as anything but a woman of modest means. Then she sat at her writing desk and, by candlelight, she wrote 3 things. The first was a letter to the border lords of the Eastern Marches, the men whose loyalty she had cultivated over 7 years, whose grievances she had heard when Cailan would not, whose sons she had found positions for, and whose harvests she had insured against the frost. She did not ask them for anything. She simply informed them, plainly, that she was leaving, and that she thanked them for their trust, and that she hoped the peace they had built together would endure. She knew what such a letter would do. She knew that men who had been valued only by her would begin, the moment they read it, to reconsider their loyalty to a king who had cast her aside. She was not above planting seeds. She had learned from the best gardeners of ruin, and she had learned that the deadliest seeds are the ones sown with a gentle hand. The second thing she wrote was a single line upon a scrap of parchment, which she left folded upon the lacquered box of untouched allowance where Cailan or his servants would find it. You valued the bloodline. I balance the books. Let us see which keeps a kingdom warm through winter. She did not sign it. She did not need to. The third thing she wrote was nothing at all, because the third thing was a knock at her door, soft and hurried, and when she opened it, she found Maren standing in the corridor, the old healer who had tended Ironcrest's sick for 40 years, whose hands had brought half the pack into the world and eased the other half out of it. Maren's face was carved with grief, and in her arms she carried a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. I heard, Maren said. The whole fortress heard. I came to see if you were fool enough to still be here, and I see that you are not fool enough to stay, but too proud to run without cleaning your own room first. Her mouth twisted, not quite a smile. You always did leave a place tidier than you found it. You should not be seen here, Seraphine said gently. It will be dangerous to have been my friend after tonight. I am 73 years old, child. Let them try to frighten me. Maren pressed the bundle into her arms. Herbs, for the road and for the bond sickness that will come when you are 3 days out and the severing finally catches up to your body. You will think you are dying. You will not be. Drink the grey tincture and sleep it off. She hesitated, then reached up and cupped Seraphine's face in one weathered hand. I have watched them use you like a plough horse for 7 years and call it honor. I have watched you save this pack a dozen times over and watched him take the credit each time. There is not a soul in the eastern half of this kingdom who does not owe you more than they owe him, whatever they were too cowardly to say tonight. Do you understand me? He did not cast out a woman. He cast out the keystone. And keystones, when they go, tend to bring the whole arch down after them. Seraphine's composure cracked then, just slightly, just enough for a single tear to fall, the only one she would permit herself. I don't want the arch to fall, she whispered. I only want to be somewhere it can't fall on me. Then go south, Maren said. Go to the free cities where a woman is worth what she can do, and not what womb she came from. And when you have made yourself into whatever you are going to become, and you will become something, I have never in my life been so certain of anything. Do not come back for revenge. Revenge is a small thing, and you were never small. The old woman's eyes glittered. Come back for what is yours. There is a difference, and you are wise enough to know it. Seraphine embraced her, briefly and fiercely, and then she shouldered the satchel and the bundle, and she went down the winding stair for the last time, out through the kitchen postern where the night cook, another old ally, another quiet debt of kindness, had left the bolt undrawn without being asked. A horse waited in the lower paddock, saddled, Maren's doing or the cook's, she never learned which, and Seraphine mounted it and rode out through the shadow of the walls she had spent 7 years defending, and the mountains swallowed her, and by the time the sun rose over Ironcrest and the servants found the folded gown and the untouched allowance and the unsigned note, she was already 20 miles gone and riding south with the wind at her back and her whole ruined heart hardening, mile by frozen mile, into something new. 6 months later, in the free city of Halvery, the woman they called Sarah Vale was known to everyone on the Copper Quay, and unknown, entirely, as the discarded Luna of a mountain pack 1,000 miles north. She had built that anonymity deliberately, the way she built everything now, with patience, with foresight, and with an almost surgical understanding of what mattered and what did not. Halvery was a city that ran on debt and grain and the ceaseless traffic of ships, a sprawling, salt-washed, sun-warmed place where the free companies of merchant lords governed by ledger rather than by blood, and it had received Seraphine the way the sea receives a river, without ceremony, absorbing her utterly, asking no questions about where she had come from so long as she proved she could swim. And she could swim. God, how she could swim. Everything she had done for Ironcrest, the negotiating, the accounting, the reading of men and markets, the patient management of 100 competing appetites, she now did for herself, and for the first time in her life she was paid for it in coin, rather than in gratitude that curdled eventually into expectation. The counting-house she had bought 18 months before, in the cold foresight of a betrayed heart, had become the seed of something far larger. She had begun by insuring cargoes, a thing the great houses did clumsily and greedily, and that she did with such precision that within 3 months the smaller captains were bringing their business to her exclusively, because Sarah Vale honoured her contracts to the letter, and never, ever cheated a man who dealt honestly with her. From insurance she had moved into brokerage, and from brokerage into lending, and from lending into the quiet, patient purchase of debt, for she had learned, in 7 years of managing a kingdom, that whoever holds a man's debts holds a leash around his throat, and that the trick of it was to hold the leash so gently that the man forgot it was there, until the day you decided to pull. By the 6th month, she employed 40 clerks and owned 3 warehouses and a stake in 11 ships, and the merchant lords of Halvery had begun to speak her name in their counting-houses with a wariness that would have amused her if she had let herself feel anything so light as amusement. She did not let herself. That was the hardest lesson of all, the one Maren had tried to teach her on the last night, that the wound mustn't be allowed to govern the work. In the early weeks the bond sickness had come exactly as the old healer promised, 3 days south of the mountains, a fever that made her think her own body was tearing itself apart, and she had drunk the grey tincture and lain in a wayside inn, shivering and hallucinating the warm thread that no longer connected her to anything, and she had wept then, in private, all the tears she had refused the great hall. And when the fever broke on the 4th morning, she had risen a different woman, not a healed one, for some wounds do not heal so much as calcify, but a woman who had put the grief in a box and buried the box beneath the foundation of everything she was going to build, so that the grief became a footing rather than a flood. She dreamed of Ironcrest sometimes. She dreamed of Caelin's face and Ivona's smile and her mother's shawl worn triumphantly by a thief. But she woke from those dreams into a life that was entirely her own, and the waking every single morning was its own quiet vengeance. Her one confidant in this new life was a man named Theron Ashcombe, a Halvery shipwright turned merchant captain, broad-shouldered and grey-eyed, and blessedly, wonderfully indifferent to rank. Theron had been the first captain to trust her with an uninsured cargo on nothing but her word, and she had paid him back at a moment when a lesser broker would have found a loophole to keep the coin, and from that single act of honesty a partnership had grown that was, she slowly realized, the healthiest thing she had ever known. Theron did not want anything from her that she did not freely offer. He respected her mind the way a craftsman respects a fine tool, admired her nerve, argued with her fiercely over cargo routes and interest rates, and never once suggested that her worth flowed from anything but her own two hands and her own sharp intellect. He was not her mate. The bond, once severed, does not simply reattach itself to the next kind man, but he was something she had never had, which was an equal. And when, one evening on the Copper Quay, with the sun sinking bloody into the western sea, he asked her plainly what had put the winter in her eyes, she found herself telling him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. "So there's a king up north," Theron said slowly, when she had finished, "who traded the woman running his kingdom for a woman with a prettier bloodline, and never once did the arithmetic on what that would cost him." "He was never good at arithmetic," Seraphine said. "It bored him. He left it to me. He left everything to me. And then he decided that everything I did was worthless because it was not glorious. Grain is not glorious, Theron. Ledgers are not glorious. But a kingdom that cannot feed itself through winter is a kingdom that dies, glory or no." She turned her cup slowly in her hands. "He is finding that out now, I think. I have heard things." She had. The information had come to her, the way information always came in Halvery, riding the ships and the caravans, whispered in the counting-houses, and it painted a picture of Ironcrest that would have broken her heart 6 months ago, and now merely confirmed her arithmetic. The Silvermoon alliance that Kaelin had traded her for had proven hollow. The Silvermoon Pax, it emerged, were themselves near ruin, their own coffers empty, their offer of Ivona a desperate attempt to bind a wealthier kingdom to their sinking fortunes. Ivona had brought no dowry worth the name, only a bloodline and a promise, and the promise had begun, almost immediately, to rot. Worse, and this was the part that made Seraphine set down her cup and go very still. There were whispers of a third party in the affair, a shadow behind the Silvermoon offer. The Pax of the far north, the ones ruled by the cold and calculating Alpha Vorlon of the Frostmere reaches, had been quietly buying up Silvermoon's debts, and Seraphine, who knew better than anyone alive what it meant to buy up a rival's debts, understood at once what Kaelin in his arrogance had not, that his marriage to Ivona had not bound Silvermoon to Ironcrest. It had bound Ironcrest to Vorlon. Kaelin had not made an alliance. He had swallowed a hook, and somewhere in the frozen north, a patient predator was letting out the line, waiting for the moment to pull. "You could warn him," Theron said, watching her face. "I could. You won't." "Not yet," Seraphine said. "A warning given too early is just information handed to a man who will misuse it. Kaelin would hear the truth from me and do the opposite, out of pride, out of the simple refusal to be right by my reckoning." She looked out at the darkening sea. "But there will come a moment when he cannot afford his pride any longer. When he needs coin so badly that he will beg it from anyone, even a Halvery house he has never heard of, run by a woman he has never met. And on that day, I will not warn him. I will simply be there, holding the only rope that can pull him out of the water. And he will have to decide in front of everyone, whether to take the hand of the person he threw away. She smiled then, and it was not a warm smile, and Theron, who had come to know her well, felt a small pity for the king 1,000 miles north, who did not yet know what was coming for him. "I am not going to destroy him, Theron. That is the mistake he would make in my place. I am going to make him understand. There is a difference, and it is the whole of it." The unravelling of Ironcrest, seen from the inside, did not announce itself with trumpets. It came the way rot comes to a great tree, silently from within, in the season after the leaves have already fallen. Calen Thornwood stood at the head of his council table on a grey morning in the deep of winter, and looked at faces that would not quite meet his eyes. And he told himself, as he had told himself every morning for months, that the difficulties were temporary. The grain stores were low, but the grain stores were always low in winter, were they not? The border lords of the eastern marches had grown cold and distant, sending their tithes late and their levies incomplete. But border lords were fractious by nature, and a firm hand would remind them of their duty. The treasury was thinner than he liked, but treasuries recovered. He told himself all of this in the confident interior voice of a man who had never in his life had to do the arithmetic, and the voice was beginning, for the first time, to sound hollow even to him. The truth, which he circled and would not land upon, was that everything had begun to go wrong on precisely the night Seraphine walked out of his great hall, and that the wrongness had a shape, and that the shape was hers. He had not understood, when he cast her out, how much of the kingdom lived inside her head. The grain distribution that kept the poorer villages fed through the frost. She had managed it by a system of her own devising that no one else fully grasped, and in her absence the system had frayed, and villages that had never gone hungry under her stewardship now sent riders begging for relief. The delicate web of favours and debts and understandings that bound the border lords to Ironcrest, she had woven it thread by thread over 7 years, and every thread had run through her hands, and now that her hands were gone, the web sagged and tore. The eastern lords had received her farewell letter, the one she had written by candlelight, the one that thanked them and asked nothing, and Calen did not know about the letter, but he felt its effect the way a man feels a draught from a door he cannot find. The lords remembered, suddenly, who had actually valued them. They remembered whose door had always been open, and they began, quietly, to wonder whether their futures lay with a king who discarded his most loyal servants for a prettier alliance. Evona was no help. This was the discovery that curdled Calen's pride most bitterly, and it was a discovery he made slowly, because he did not want to make it at all. He had chosen Ivona for her bloodline and her beauty and the alliance she promised, and he had assumed, with the lazy assumption of a man who had never had to think about such things, that she would simply step into the role Seraphine had vacated, that queens were interchangeable, that the work would somehow continue to be done because the work had always somehow continued to be done. But Evona did not know how to manage a grain store, or read a ledger, or settle a dispute between grazing lords. Evona had never in her life balanced a single account. When Calen, in the 3rd month, had asked her to review the treasury figures because he could make no sense of them himself, she had looked at the columns of numbers with a blank and faintly irritated expression, and said, "This is steward's work, my love. Surely you have people for this." And Calen had felt the floor tilt beneath him, because he had had a person for this. One person, and he had made her kneel and then made her leave, and the enormity of it was only beginning to open beneath him like a crevasse in spring ice. He did not blame himself. Not yet. Men like Cailan do not arrive at self-blame directly. They arrive at it by way of a long and winding road paved with the blaming of everyone else. So he blamed the border lords for their disloyalty, and the villages for their weakness, and the weather for the poor harvest, and Ivona, privately, for being decorative when he had needed her to be useful. He even blamed Seraphine for leaving, as though she had betrayed him by declining to be betrayed quietly, as though her competence had been a trap she had sprung on him by taking it away. What he did not do, what he could not yet bring himself to do, was to understand. And so the rot spread, unnamed and unaddressed, because the one man with the power to stop it refused to look at its face. The whispers of Vorlan reached him too, though he made less of them than he should have. Silvermoon's emissaries, who had once come cap in hand seeking the marriage, now came with a different bearing entirely, with a coolness, a subtle assurance, as though they were the ones who had done Ironcrest a favour and were merely waiting to be repaid. And behind them, always, was the name of the Northern Alpha, dropped into conversations like a stone into a pond. Alpha Vorlan sends his regards. Alpha Vorlan trusts the alliance prospers. Alpha Vorlan wonders whether Ironcrest might have need of a loan in these lean months on terms most generous. Cailan, who did not do arithmetic, heard the offer of a generous loan and thought it kindness. Seraphine, 1,000 miles away, would have heard the same words and known them for the closing of a jaw. But Seraphine was not there to translate, because Cailan had made certain she was not there. And so the offer sat on the table, and the winter deepened, and the treasury emptied, and the great tree of Ironcrest stood proud and hollow against the grey sky, its rot invisible, its fall already written in a ledger it could not read. It was Maren who finally forced the reckoning, or the beginning of it. The old healer had watched the kingdom sicken with the same clear eye she brought to a fevered child, and when the food shortages reached the fortress kitchens themselves, when the servants began to grow thin, and the lower villages sent their dying to her door, because there was no relief coming from the crown, she went to Cailan directly, uninvited, and stood before his council table with 40 years of earned authority in her spine. "You are killing them," she said, without preamble, because she was 73 and had no fear left to spend. "The eastern villages, the grain is not reaching them. The system that fed them is broken, and no one here knows how to mend it, because the woman who built it is gone, and you sent her." She let the silence stretch. "I am not asking you to feel shame, Cailan Thornwood. You are too proud for shame, and shame will not fill an empty belly. I am telling you a fact, as I would tell you a wound has gone septic. Your kingdom is dying of a wound you gave it, and there is only one physician alive who knows the cure, and she is in the south building an empire while you sit here blaming the snow." Cailan's fury was a magnificent thing, and it filled the council chamber, and it changed nothing, because fury never does. "She is a traitor who abandoned her post," he snarled. "She is a woman you humiliated in front of 300 wolves, and then expected to stay," Maren said. "You did not lose a servant. You threw away the keystone, exactly as I warned you that you would, on the night you first said that other one's name with honey in your mouth." She turned to go, then paused at the door and delivered the line that would echo in Cailan's skull through all the long nights to come. "The whole arch is falling, my king, and you are standing beneath it, and you still think the sky is merely cloudy." Spring came late to Ironcrest that year, And it came with a reckoning. The generous loan from the north had been taken. In the end, Kaelin had signed it in the desperate weeks after the worst of the winter, when the treasury could no longer meet the fortress payroll, and the border lords had begun openly withholding their tithes, and he had signed it the way a drowning man grasps a hand without checking whether the hand means to save him or to pull him under. The terms had seemed generous. That was the genius of them. Alpha Vorlon of Frostmere had asked for no crippling interest, no immediate repayment, only certain modest considerations, preferential trading rights through the mountain passes, a small garrison of Frostmere wolves stationed at the eastern watchtowers to protect the shared interests of the Alliance, and the appointment of a Frostmere factor to oversee the terms of the loan from within Ironcrest itself. Kaelin, who did not do arithmetic and did not do strategy either, had read these terms as the reasonable precautions of a friendly creditor. He did not understand until the garrison was in place and the factor was installed in the counting house, and the trading rights had quietly strangled Ironcrest's own merchants, that he had not borrowed money. He had sold his kingdom, one clause at a time, to a man who had been buying it up from the moment he first whispered Ivona's name into the ear of the desperate Silver Moon lords. By midsummer, the truth could no longer be evaded even by a man as gifted at evasion as Kaelin Thornwood. The Frostmere garrison at the watchtowers had grown from a token force into an occupation. The factor in the counting house now approved or denied every expenditure of the crown, citing the terms of the loan. Ironcrest's own trade had withered under the preferential rights granted to Frostmere merchants, so that the kingdom grew poorer by the month, even as it labored harder, and the poorer it grew, the more it needed the loan. And the more it needed the loan, the tighter Vorlon drew the line. It was, Kaelin finally understood one sleepless night with a clarity that came far too late, exactly the strategy that Seraphine had used against a dozen of Ironcrest's rivals in the years when she had run his kingdom, the patient purchase of another's dependence. The leash held so gently, the victim did not feel it until the day it pulled. He had watched her do it. He had praised her for it, in the careless way he praised all her work, and he had never once imagined it could be done to him, because he had never imagined himself as anything but the hunter. Now he was the hook-swallowed fish, and the woman who could have warned him, the woman who would have seen Vorland's game from the first sentence of the first letter, was 1,000 miles south and had every reason in the world to let him drown. Ivona left in the autumn. This was the final humiliation, and it was a fitting one, because it revealed her for exactly what she had always been. When it became clear that Ironcrest was not the rich prize she had been promised, but a sinking kingdom in the grip of a foreign creditor, when the crown could no longer keep her in the silks and jewels she had married it for, Ivona's affection evaporated like dew. She had never loved Kaelin. Seraphine had known that on the night of the coronation, and Kaelin had refused to know it for a year. But he knew it now. On the grey morning, he found her chambers empty, and a note upon the pillow, a note that echoed, though he did not know it, the note Seraphine had left a year before, and echoed it in a way that flayed him. Ivona had written only, "You valued my bloodline. My bloodline values a solvent kingdom. I go where the coffers are full." It was the cruelty of it that undid him, the sheer transactional coldness, the treatment of himself as a resource to be spent and abandoned. He had done exactly this to Seraphine. He had made a woman kneel and told her she was worth less than an alliance, and now the alliance had risen and told him he was worth less than a full treasury, and the symmetry of it was so perfect and so merciless that he sat down on the edge of the empty bed and laughed a terrible, broken laugh. And then he did not laugh any more. Ivona had gone north, it was later learned. She had gone to Frostmere. She had gone, in fact, to Vorlan, for it emerged that she had been Vorlan's instrument from the beginning, planted in Seraphine's life years ago, the half-dead woman in the snowbank whom Seraphine had so kindly saved, the friend who had wept into a borrowed shawl. All of it a long game, all of it patient. Cailan had not stolen Seraphine's friend and traded away his loyal Luna for love or even for lust. He had been played, from the first move to the last, by a northern alpha, who had seen in Cailan's pride the perfect lever to pry open a kingdom. And Evona had been the wedge. Cailan learned all of this too late to matter, and he learned it alone because he had spent a year driving away everyone who might have stood beside him. The border lords had all but seceded, governing their marches as independent territories and paying Ironcrest no more heed than they paid the weather. The council had thinned as wiser heads slipped away to more stable packs. Maren still came, still tended the sick, still spoke to him with her merciless clarity. But even Maren had stopped pretending there was a path back to how things were. And so, in the depths of a second winter that his kingdom could not possibly survive without relief, Cailan Thornwood was forced at last to do the thing his pride had sworn he would never do. He was forced to seek a loan from outside the north, to find some southern house, wealthy enough and independent enough of Vorlan's web to buy out the Frostmere debt and break the leash before it strangled Ironcrest entirely. His advisers made inquiries. The inquiries came back with a single name, spoken with the wary respect that the merchant world reserves for the truly formidable. The House of Vale, of Halvery, the swiftest rising trading house in all the southern free cities, holder of debts across half the known world, run by a woman of legendary discipline whom no one had ever successfully cheated and who was said to hold grudges the way the sea holds salt. If any house in the south had the capital and the nerve to buy out Frostmere and stand against Vorlan, it was the House of Vale. Cailan, who had never heard the name Sarah Vale, who did not connect it to anything, who saw only a lifeline, gave the order to send an emissary south to beg for terms. And then, when the emissary's first cautious letters came back suggesting that the House of Vale would treat only with the king himself, that its mistress did not extend credit of such magnitude to underlings, Cailan swallowed the last of his pride like a stone and prepared to make the journey to Halvery in person, to kneel, if he had to, before a stranger, to save the kingdom he had ruined. He did not know he was riding toward the woman he had made kneel first. He did not know the crown he had refused her was the very thing she had gone south to forge in a shape he could not take away. The House of Vale occupied a tall, pale building at the head of the Copper Quay, its windows looking out over a forest of masts. And it was here, on a bright, cold morning in the last of the winter, that Cailan Thornwood arrived to beg for the survival of his kingdom. He had travelled hard and travelled humble, in plain clothes, with a retinue of only 4, because pride is expensive, and he could no longer afford it, and because some deep, exhausted part of him had begun at last to suspect that the humbling was deserved. He was thinner than he had been. There was grey at his temples that had not been there a year and a half before. He climbed the pale stone steps of the House of Vale with the gait of a man walking toward a judgment, and he was shown, by a young clerk with a carefully neutral face, into a long room with a great window full of sea light and a broad desk of dark southern wood, behind which a high-backed chair sat turned away from him, facing the water. "The mistress of the house will see you," the clerk said, and withdrew, and the door closed, and Cailan stood alone in the sea light, hat in hand, and waited. For a long moment the chair did not move. He could see, over its high back, the crown of a head, dark hair, coiled and pinned in the severe fashion of the southern merchant women, and one hand resting on the arm of the chair, unadorned by any ring, still and composed. He cleared his throat. "I am Calen Thornwood," he said, "Alpha King of Ironcrest. I have come a very long way, and at great cost to my pride, to ask the House of Vale for its help. My kingdom is—" He stopped, because the chair had begun, slowly, to turn. It turned the way a season turns, the way a judgment turns, unhurried and inevitable. And as it came round, Calen saw first the line of a familiar jaw, and then the curve of a cheek he had once known better than his own. And then the eyes. Those eyes, grey and level and colder than any winter he had survived. And the words died in his throat, and something in his chest, the raw and half-healed place where the bond had been, gave a single, violent lurch, a phantom spasm of a connection, long since severed. His hat fell from his hand. He did not notice it fall. "Seraphine," he whispered. "Sarah Vale," she corrected, and her voice was perfectly calm, perfectly even, the voice of a woman reading harvest figures. Seraphine Thornwood died in a great hall a year and a half ago, on the night she was told her 7 years of service were worth less than a bloodline. You were there, I believe. You may recall it. You asked her to kneel. Calen could not speak. The whole architecture of his understanding was collapsing in real time, every assumption rearranging itself around the impossible fact of her face. The House of Vale. The legendary mistress no one could cheat. The formidable woman who held debts across half the world and grudges like salt. It had been her. It had been her all along. He had ridden 1,000 miles to beg the woman he had discarded, and he had not known it until this instant. And the not knowing was itself the final proof of everything she had ever tried to tell him, that he had never truly seen her. Not once, not in 7 years, that she had been the engine of his entire world, and he had looked straight through her as though she were a window. "I did not know," he managed. "The House of Vale, I did not know it was you." "No," Seraphine agreed. "You never did. That was always the trouble." She rose from the chair, unhurried, and came around the desk, and he saw that she moved differently now, that the deference had gone out of her spine, that she carried herself like a woman who owned the room and the building and the key beyond it, which of course she did. "Sit down, Calen. You look as though you have ridden a long way to fall on your knees, and I would not want you to injure yourself. Sit. We are going to talk about your kingdom, and about a loan, and about a great many things you should have understood 1.5 years ago, and are only now, I think, beginning to." He sat, because his legs would no longer hold him, and she remained standing, and the reversal of it, she who had knelt in his hall now standing over him in hers, was not lost on either of them. "You have come to buy out the Frostmare debt," she said. "It was not a question. You have come because you finally understand that Vorlan owns you, that the loan was never a loan, that the marriage was never an alliance, that Ivona was never your queen but Vorlan's blade, and that you were played from the first move to the last by a man who read your pride the way I used to read your ledgers." She watched the confirmation move across his face, each fact landing like a blow. "I know all of it, Calen. I have known most of it for 1 year. I watched Vorlan buy up Silvermoon's debts, and I knew exactly what he was doing, because it is precisely what I would have done. Precisely what I did do to 12 of your rivals in the years you called it my little cleverness and could not be bothered to learn." She let that sit. "I could have warned you. Did you know that? 6 months in, I could have sent you a letter that laid the whole trap bare, and you would have had time to escape it. I chose not to. Do you understand why? Because I deserved it, Kaelin said, very low. No, Seraphine said, and something flickered in her cold eyes, something that was not quite pity but was adjacent to it. Because you wouldn't have believed me. Because your pride would have taken the truth from my hand and done the opposite of it, out of spite, out of the sheer refusal to be saved by the woman you had thrown away. A warning is only useful to a man capable of receiving it, and 18 months ago you were not that man. The trap had to close on you. You had to feel the jaws. It was the only teacher you would ever have listened to. She moved to the great window and looked out at the masts and the water. So here we are. The jaws are closed. And now, at last, you are a man who might be capable of hearing the truth, because you have finally paid enough to be interested in it. That is the only reason I agreed to see you, not for old times. There are no old times for the arithmetic. Kaelin looked at her silhouette against the sea light, and the enormity of what he had done rose up in him, not as an abstraction now, but as a physical weight, and he found that he was weeping, silently, in the way of a man who has not wept in decades, and has forgotten how to stop it once it starts. I am sorry, he said. Seraphine, Sarah, I am sorry. I did not know what you were. I did not know what I had. I told myself grain was not glorious, and ledgers were not glorious, and I was a fool. I was a blind, arrogant fool, and I have destroyed everything you built, everything. The villages are starving, and the lords have gone, and Ironcrest is dying, and it is all my doing, all of it. And I have come here to beg you. Stop, she said, without turning. Do not beg. It embarrasses us both, and it is beside the point. I did not bring you across 1,000 miles to watch you grovel. Groveling is cheap, and I have learned to distrust anything cheap. She turned from the window at last, and the sea light was behind her, and her face was in shadow, and her voice, when it came, was the level, terrible voice of a woman who has thought about this moment for 18 months and knows exactly what she means to do with it. Sit up, Kaelin. Dry your face. We are going to save your kingdom. But we are going to do it on my terms, and by the time we are finished, you are going to understand precisely what those terms cost, and precisely what you threw into the snow. Now, let us begin with the arithmetic. What followed was not a negotiation, because a negotiation implies two parties with leverage, and Kaelin Thornwood had none. What followed was an accounting, in the fullest and most merciless sense of that word, a reckoning laid out in figures on the dark southern desk, in Seraphine's precise hand, of everything that Ironcrest owed and everything Ironcrest had, and the distance between the two, which was the distance of a kingdom's grave. She had, he realized as she spoke, known the state of his coffers better than his own factors did. She had agents in Frostmere and Silvermoon, and among his own border lords. She had assembled, over 18 patient months, a portrait of his ruin so complete that she could tell him things about his own kingdom that he did not know. And as she laid it out, the Frostmere garrison, the strangled trade, the fled lords, the empty granaries, the loan that was not a loan, Kaelin understood that she was not merely offering to save him. She had already, before he ever set foot on her stairs, made herself the only creature on earth capable of it. She had brought his rescue into existence the way she had once bought a counting house in Halvery on the night his affection first strayed, with cold foresight in the ruins of a broken heart. Here is what will happen, she said. The House of Vale will buy out the Frostmere debt in its entirety. Every clause, every consideration. The garrison at your watchtowers will be withdrawn, because the terms that placed it there will be void, and Vorlon will withdraw it, because Vorlon is, above all things, a rational man, and a rational man doesn't fight a war for a debt he no longer holds. The trading rights will revert. The factor in your counting house will be dismissed. Ironcrest's trade will be free again. She paused. And you will owe all of this to the House of Vale instead. You understand that. I am not freeing you, Cailan. I am buying your leash from a man who meant to hang you with it, and I am holding it in my own hand. The question you must ask yourself, the only question that matters, is whether you trust the woman holding it more than you trusted the man who held it before. I trust you, Cailan said at once, and the swiftness of it, the desperate certainty of it, made her smile faintly and without warmth. You should not answer so quickly. You trusted me once, in your careless way, and you crowned another woman and made me kneel. Trust that costs nothing is worth nothing. She set down her pen. But as it happens, you may trust me, and for a reason that has nothing to do with sentiment. You may trust me because my terms are designed to make your survival my profit. I do not want Ironcrest to die, Cailan. A dead kingdom pays no debts. I want Ironcrest to live, and to prosper, and to pay the House of Vale a steady and reasonable return for a generation, and to become, in time, exactly what it should always have been. A well-run kingdom that feeds its people and honors its lords, and does not swallow every hook a northern predator dangles in front of its pride. That is what I am buying. Not your gratitude, your recovery. Because your recovery, unlike your gratitude, appears on a ledger. She slid a document across the desk toward him. A contract, drawn up in advance, in her own hand, complete and waiting. Because of course it was. Because she had known he would come before he had known it himself. He read it. It was, he saw with a kind of awe, scrupulously fair. She had not gouged him. She had not buried a poison clause in the fine print the way Vorlan had. The terms were firm, but survivable. Generous even. The terms of a creditor who genuinely wished the debtor to thrive. And yet every line of it placed the House of Vale in a position of quiet, unbreakable control over the future of Ironcrest, so that for the next 20 years, no major decision of the Crown could be made without the knowledge and, in the largest matters, the consent of a woman in Holvery whom Cailan had once ordered to kneel. It was the leash, exactly as she had said. But it was a leash held by a hand that meant him to live. And that, he understood, was the whole of her vengeance, and the whole of her mercy, indistinguishable, folded into one another like the two halves of a single blade. She would save him, and in saving him, she would own him, and in owning him, she would prove, every day for 20 years, exactly what he had thrown away when he called her worth less than a bloodline. There is one more term, Seraphine said when he had read it through. It is not in the document, because it is not the kind of term one writes down. But it is not negotiable, and I will have your word on it before you sign, and if you break it, the whole arrangement voids, and I let Vorlan have you. She leaned forward, and the sea light caught her eyes at last, and they were not cold now. They were something deeper and older than cold. You will go home, and you will govern well. Not for me, not to repay me. You will govern well, because your people have suffered for your pride, and they deserve, at last, a king who does the arithmetic. You will feed the eastern villages. You will make peace with the lords you drove away, on your knees if that is what it takes, and I think you will find that kneeling is not so terrible a thing as you once believed. I found it survivable when you ordered it of me. You will learn the ledgers yourself, Cailan, with your own eyes and your own hands, because you will never again have the luxury of calling such work beneath you. And if you ever again mistake loyalty for a thing you are owed, if you ever again look through a person who serves you as though they were a window, I will know. I have agents in every corner of your kingdom, and I will know, and I will remember that I once held your survival in my hand and chose to spare you, and I will reconsider the choice. Do you understand me? I understand, Cailan said, and he did, at last, fully, for the first time in his life. He picked up the pen. His hand shook only a little. Seraphine. Sarah. Sarah. He looked up at her, and there was no plea in his face now, no grovelling, only a kind of clean and terrible clarity, the face of a man who has finally seen the shape of his own life. Why did you save me? Truly. You could have let Vorlan finish it. You could have bought Ironcrest out of his hands and taken it for yourself, and no one in the world would have blamed you. You held every card. Why spare the man who made you kneel? For a long moment she did not answer. The sea light shifted on the water beyond the window, and somewhere below on the copper quay a ship's bell rang the changing of the watch, and Seraphine looked at him with those grey and level eyes, and seemed to weigh something she had weighed many times before. Because taking Ironcrest would have made me you, she said at last. It would have made worth a thing I seized by force, a crown pulled off one head and set upon another. And I did not go south to become the thing that broke me. I went south to prove that worth cannot be given or taken at all, that it is built and earned and carried in the hands, and that no king in a great hall has the power to grant it or revoke it, however loudly he commands the kneeling. She straightened. You asked me once to crown another woman. I told you I would not kneel to crown a thief. So instead I went and forged a crown you could never take from me, out of grain and ledgers and the patient purchase of debt. And I am wearing it now, in this room, and you have ridden 1,000 miles to sit beneath it. That is enough. That was always all I wanted. Not your ruin, but your understanding. And I have it. I can see that I have it. So sign, Cailan. Go home. Feed your people, and live the rest of your life knowing exactly what I was. He signed. His name went onto the paper in a hand steadier than he expected, and when it was done, she took the document and blotted it and set it in a drawer, and the thing was finished, and Ironcrest was saved, and the man who had cast her into the snow was bound for 20 years to the survival she had chosen to grant him. He rose to leave. At the door he paused, hat in hand once more, and turned back. Evona said the shawl suited her, he said quietly. Your mother's shawl. I never understood that night, what it cost you. I understand now. Keep the understanding, Seraphine said, already turning back to her desk and her figures, already returning to the empire that was wholly her own. It is the only thing of value you have left to carry home. And she did not watch him go. She had watched him for 7 years, and it had cost her everything. And now she had a house to run, and 11 ships upon the water, and 40 clerks who respected her hands, and not her blood. And the door closed behind the king of the north, and she picked up her pen, and she did not look up, and the winter sun poured gold across the ledgers of a woman who had crowned herself.